A woman walked out of the twilight with nothing but a patched-up shawl and a story in her eyes. Her name was Josie Calhoun, and she didn't come this far to be turned away by a locked door. The sun had already surrendered behind Sierra Blanca, but Josie wasn't slowing down. Her boots crunched on the gravel path leading to the Thatcher Ranch house, a place that looked like it was holding its breath, waiting for the world to finally forget it existed. Dust clung to her like a second skin. Her satchel was light, but what she carried in her chest was heavy as a tombstone. The house stood stubborn against the dying light. Weather-beaten boards, a porch that sagged like a tired old man, and fence lines that had given up trying to keep anything in or out. It was a picture of defeat, but it was still standing. And so was she. She stepped onto the porch. She knocked twice. Not a polite tap, a demand. The door opened a crack. A man's face, carved from granite and shadow, filled the gap. His jaw was set so tight it could have cracked a walnut. His eyes were narrow slits, ready to shut out the world. "Yes?" he said, and the word was a threat. Josie kept her voice as flat and steady as the horizon. "I heard you need a cook." The man, Beau Thatcher, didn't blink. "Did you now?" "Trader on the trail told me," Josie said, her eyes sweeping over the decay. "Said the Thatcher Ranch was holding on by a thread. Looks like he wasn't lying." His grip on the door tightened. "We ain't looking for charity." "I don't work for free," Josie said, her voice like steel. "But I don't beg, neither." And that's when she saw them. Movement behind him. A boy, maybe 8 years old, with his arms crossed just like his father. A perfect little mirror of misery. And a little girl, clinging to a ragged doll, her eyes wide as silver dollars, peeking out from behind Beau's leg. Josie's nose caught the scent of the house. Cold ash, old grease, the stale, sad smell of a home that hadn't known a real meal in months. It was the smell of giving up. "You got a stove that still works?" she asked. Beau didn't answer. His eyes flicked to her hands, calloused and capable. Then to her satchel, so light it told its own story of hardship. He looked back at the two small faces in the shadows. He was trapped. By pride, by poverty, by the two little heartbeats that depended on him. "One night," he said, stepping back just enough for her to pass. Josie didn't thank him. Gratitude was a luxury. She just stepped inside. And she knew right then that this wasn't just a job. This was a battlefield. And the war had already begun. The house was a hollow thing, bare and cold. The hearth was a tomb of gray ash. The kitchen was cluttered but not filthy, a testament to chores half done and meals skipped entirely. A dented skillet, black with the ghosts of failed dinners, leaned against a pile of kindling. It was a sad sight, but to Josie it was a start. She set down her bag, rolled up her sleeves, and moved like she owned the place. She didn't ask for permission. Folks like her learned early on that waiting for permission was just a fancy way of starving. Beau leaned against the doorway, arms still crossed, watching her every move. He was a statue of suspicion. The boy Toby hovered by the stairs, his scowl a permanent fixture. But his eyes kept darting to that old skillet. The little girl, Millie, stood frozen, clutching her doll as if it were the only thing holding her together. Josie crouched by the hearth. The wood was decent. The skillet just needed a good scrub. It would hold. She didn't need an answer. She just needed to work. Within minutes, the room filled with the crackle of a new fire, a small sound of defiance against the crushing silence. She found a sack of cornmeal and a jar of lard, scraped nearly clean. It wasn't much, but in the right hands, it was enough. "Boy's name?" she asked, her back to them. "Toby," Beau's voice grunted from the doorway. Josie nodded, flipping a cake in the sizzling skillet. "Toby," she said, not looking up. "You ever flipped cornbread?" The boy's frown deepened. He didn't answer. "Good," Josie said. "Means you ain't learned any bad habits yet." She held out the spatula, an offering, a challenge. Toby hesitated. For a moment his pride wrestled with his hunger. Hunger won. He shuffled over, taking the spatula from her hand like it might bite him. His first flip was a disaster, batter splattering across the hearthstone. Josie didn't even flinch. "Well," she said, That's one way not to do it. Try again. And he did. Millie, the little girl, edged closer, drawn by the warmth and the smell. Josie gave her a quick, small smile. You like cornbread, little miss? Millie gave a tiny, almost invisible nod. By the time the last cake came off the skillet, the entire feeling in the kitchen had shifted. It wasn't a house waiting to fall apart anymore. It was a house remembering how to be a home. They ate without talking, but the silence was different now. Toby ate like he was memorizing the taste. Millie's doll sat on her lap instead of being clutched like a shield. Bo sat across from them, his chewing slowing, like a man who wasn't used to noticing his own hunger anymore. When the plates were empty, Josie wiped her hands. House this size shouldn't sound so empty, Mr. Thatcher. Bo's eyes narrowed. Don't need filling up. Maybe, she countered. Or maybe it's just waiting for someone to light the stove proper. He didn't have an answer for that. He just nodded toward the parlor. Couch is yours for the night. Josie gathered her satchel. We'll see if one night's enough. As she passed, Millie's doll slipped from her lap, landing at Josie's feet. Josie bent down, picked it up, and gently placed it back in the little girl's arms. The doll was worn, its button eyes hanging by a thread. She's got some fight left in her, Josie said softly. Millie's fingers curled around the doll, and for a split second, a smile flickered across her face, quick as a match struck in the dark. Josie saw it. She hung her old apron on a hook by the door. The lamplight caught Bo's face, and for just a moment, she saw something flicker in his eyes. Not stone, not anymore. But then she noticed something else. Out the window, far across the dark fields, a single, distant light. It blinked once, then twice, like a signal, and Josie felt a cold dread snake its way up her spine. This wasn't just a hungry family. This was a target, and she had just walked right into the middle of it. The fire was crackling long before the sun rose. Josie Calhoun moved through the Thatcher kitchen like a ghost who knew where everything belonged. The skillet hissed, and the smell of frying cornmeal was a declaration of war against the misery that clung to the house. It didn't take long for the others to stir. Toby appeared on the staircase, trying his best to look uninterested, but his stomach was betraying him. Millie stood in the shadows of the doorway, her little hands wrapped tight around her tattered doll. Josie had heard her whisper its name the night before. Sparrow. Josie didn't coax them over. She let the rhythm of her work be the invitation. The scrape of a spoon, the shuffle of her boots on the pine floor. The house, which had felt so empty, now hummed with the small sounds of life. You folks always this talkative? Josie said over her shoulder. Or is it just me? Toby's scowl was automatic, but it had no heat. Millie's grip on Sparrow loosened, just a little. Then Bo's voice cut in, dry as a bone. Silence keeps the wolves guessing. Josie turned. He was leaning in the doorway, same spot as last night, arms folded. A man standing guard over his own ruins. She poured coffee into a chipped tin cup and slid it onto the table. He took it without a word. The four of them sat at the table in a fragile truce. Toby ate like the food might vanish. Millie nibbled, her eyes darting to Josie, trying to solve the puzzle of this strange woman who had appeared out of the dusk. It was the doll Sparrow that broke the silence. Josie saw its arm was dangling by a single stubborn thread. Without a word, she reached into her satchel and pulled out a small leather pouch, worn soft by years of use. Inside was a needle and a coil of stout thread. She didn't ask permission. She just held her hand out to Millie. The little girl hesitated. Toby watched, his fork halfway to his mouth. Then slowly, as if handing over a sacred relic, Millie placed Sparrow in Josie's hand. Josie's fingers moved with a practiced grace, stitching the doll's arm back on with tight, clean pulls. She wasn't just mending cloth. She was mending a childhood. Your Sparrow's seen better days, Josie said softly. A tiny smile touched Millie's lips. When Josie handed the doll back, the girl clutched it tight, her eyes shining. Toby, not wanting to be left out, stood up abruptly. I can flip the next one. Josie stepped aside from the stove. All yours, Mr. Thatcher. He fumbled the first one, but he stuck with it. By the third flip, a grin he couldn't hide spread across his face. Bo watched from his corner, sipping his coffee. But Josie saw it. The muscle in his jaw had unclenched. Just a little. The quiet that fell after breakfast was different. It wasn't empty. It was waiting. Bo set his cup down. You seem to think mending dolls and frying cakes is all this place needs. Josie met his gaze. I think it's a start. His fingers tapped a restless rhythm on the table. You ought to know, the Silverthorne Syndicate's been sniffing around this land. They don't buy, they take. Last man who said no found his barn burned to the ground. The distant light from last night. It all clicked into place. This wasn't just hardship. It was a siege. I've seen bullies before, Josie said, her voice dangerously calm. They ain't half as scary as a burnt skillet. A flicker of something, annoyance, respect, crossed Bo's face. You don't scare easy. Josie glanced over her shoulder, a ghost of a smirk on her lips. That's what's kept me alive this long. But then she saw it again, through the window, the glint of sunlight on something metal, way out by the collapsed fence line. A spyglass. Someone was watching them, right now. The name Silverthorne Syndicate landed in the room like a rattlesnake. Josie felt the air change, but she didn't let it show. She just kept her eyes on the window, on that tiny, menacing glint of light in the distance. They were being watched, every move, every word. Bo pushed his chair back and stood, his posture that of a man who'd spent years bracing for a storm. He grabbed his hat from a peg. Got fences that need mending, he said, his voice flat. He was trying to pretend it was a normal day, a normal chore. But they both knew it wasn't. Josie didn't offer to help. She just set the skillet back on its hook. As Bo stepped onto the porch, he paused. His gaze lingered on the thin column of smoke rising from their chimney, a signal to anyone watching that the house was no longer empty. He stood there a beat too long, then walked out into the yard, his back as straight as a rifle barrel. Inside, Josie knelt by Millie. She tucked a loose thread on Sparrow's newly mended arm. She'll hold together now, she whispered, loud enough for the girl to hear. And so would they. The day passed in a tense quiet. Josie found a rhythm in the forgotten chores of the house. She swept floors, patched curtains, and scrubbed years of grime from the windows, letting the sunlight spill into the dark corners. With every sweep of the broom, she felt like she was clearing away not just dust, but despair. Toby, seeing her work, started mimicking her. He grabbed a rag and started polishing an old tarnished lantern, his small face set in a look of intense concentration. Millie arranged and rearranged a set of chipped teacups on a shelf. They were a strange, silent crew, rebuilding their world one small task at a time. But the feeling of being watched never left. It was a constant pressure at the back of her neck. As evening approached, Josie was kneading dough on the flour-dusted table when she heard it. The sound of a horse moving too fast. Not Bo's steady workhorse. This was something else, something urgent. She wiped her hands on her apron and stepped onto the porch. A rider was tearing across the plains, heading straight for them. It was Clyde Harlow, the old saddle maker from the town of Larkspur. He was a friend of Bo's late wife, a man known for his honesty and his stubbornness. He pulled his horse to a skidding halt in the yard, his face grim. "Bo!" he yelled, dismounting before the horse had even stopped. "They're making their move!" Bo came running from the direction of the barn, a wrench still in his hand. "What is it, Clyde?" "It's Stroud," Clyde panted, his chest heaving. "From the syndicate. He's in Larkspur. He's got Sheriff Penrose with him. They're at the land office right now, filing a claim against your property. Said you defaulted on a debt you never even took out." Bo's face went pale under his tan. A forged debt. A classic syndicate move. Clean, legal, and impossible to fight once the ink was dry. "They're stealing my land," Bo whispered, the words catching in his throat. "Not just yours," Clyde said, his eyes finding Josie. "They filed on 3 other ranches this morning. Anyone who stood up to them. They're not just taking pieces anymore, Bo. They're trying to swallow the whole valley in one gulp." Josie felt a cold fury rise in her. This was the end game. They weren't just intimidating. They were erasing people from the map. Suddenly, Toby, who had been listening from the doorway, let out a sharp gasp. He pointed toward the horizon. "Look!" Josie and the men turned. In the distance, rising from the direction of the neighboring ranch, the one owned by a man named Henderson, who had publicly refused the syndicate's offer last month, was a thick, black pillar of smoke. It wasn't a chimney, it was a building, a barn, or maybe a house. It was a fire, a message. And the message was simple: sign the papers, or burn. The sight of that black smoke changed everything. It wasn't a threat anymore. It was a promise. Bo stood frozen, the wrench hanging uselessly from his hand. He looked like a man watching his own ghost rise from the earth. All the fight seemed to drain out of him, replaced by a hollow, familiar despair. But Josie wasn't looking at the smoke. She was looking at Clyde Harlow. "Clyde," she said, her voice low and urgent. "Did Bo's wife ever mention anything specific? Names? Places? Anything the syndicate might be after on this land?" Clyde looked from the smoke back to Josie, his old eyes sharp. His wife, Eleanor? She was a smart woman, kept records of everything. She used to say this land had a secret. Said Old Man Thatcher, Bo's grandfather, didn't build this place here by accident. "A secret?" Bo muttered, shaking his head as if waking from a dream. "What secret? It's just dust and rock." "She never said what," Clyde admitted, "but she was looking for something. She had a box, an old wooden chest she kept hidden." Josie's mind raced. A hidden box. A secret. This wasn't just a land grab. The syndicate knew something. They wanted something specific. "Where is it?" Josie demanded. "The box." Bo stared at her, his expression blank. I I don't know. After she passed, I packed her things away. I couldn't bear to look at them." He gestured vaguely toward a small dusty storage room off the kitchen. Probably in there, buried under a decade of dust. Josie didn't wait for permission. She strode past him, into the storage room. It was a graveyard of forgotten things. Dust motes danced in the single beam of light from the door. Broken tools, old blankets, the ghosts of a life that had been. She started pulling things aside, her hands moving with a frantic energy. "What are you doing?" Bo asked from the doorway, his voice laced with a strange mix of anger and pain. "Those are her things. Leave them be." "Your wife was trying to tell you something, Bo," Josie shot back, pulling a heavy trunk into the center of the room. "She was trying to fight, and you buried her fight right along with her." Her words hit him like a physical blow. He flinched. Josie pried open the trunk. Inside were folded linens, a wedding dress yellowed with age, and at the very bottom, a small, intricately carved wooden box. It wasn't locked. She lifted the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was not a deed or a map or gold. It was a single strange-looking rock. It was dark, almost black, but shot through with thick, unmistakable veins of pure, gleaming silver. Clyde Harlow gasped from the doorway. "Silver," he breathed. The old legends were true. The Spanish silver vein. Everyone thought it was a myth. So that was it. The Thatcher Ranch wasn't just dirt and rock. It was sitting on a fortune the syndicate was willing to kill for. Bo stared at the rock, his face a mask of disbelief. All these years he'd been starving on top of a treasure. But as Josie looked closer, she realized it wasn't just a rock. There was something etched into the flat underside. A set of numbers, not coordinates, not a date. And then she saw him, Toby, standing in the doorway, his face ashen. He wasn't looking at the rock. He was staring at the intricate carvings on the outside of the box. "I know that box," he whispered, his voice trembling. "The bad man had one just like it." Josie's blood ran cold. "What bad man, Toby?" "The night Mama died," the boy said, tears welling in his eyes. "He was here. I saw him. He was looking for her box. He had one too, with the same snake carved on the lid." A snake. The Silverthorn Syndicate's logo. It all crashed down on Josie at once. Eleanor Thatcher's death wasn't an accident. The fire at the Henderson place wasn't just a warning. This was a hunt. And the syndicate man Stroud wasn't just trying to steal their land. He was a murderer, coming back to finish the job he started years ago. The revelation hit the small room like a lightning strike. Eleanor Thatcher hadn't died from a fever, like the town doctor had said. She had been murdered by a man with a snake-carved box, a man from the syndicate. Toby had seen him. He had been a little boy, hiding in the shadows, and had been too scared to ever speak of it, until now. Bo sank onto a nearby crate, the strength gone from his legs. He looked at his son, then at the silver-laced rock, and a decade of grief and denial shattered in an instant. His wife hadn't just been taken from him, she'd been stolen, murdered for a secret she was trying to protect. His silence, his retreat from the world, hadn't protected his family. It had left them vulnerable, waiting for the killer to return. "The numbers," Josie said, her voice cutting through the haze of shock. She held up the rock. "Toby, did you see what the man did? Did he have a key? A map?" Toby shook his head, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. "No, he was angry. He kept saying Mama had hidden it. The other half." "The other half?" "It wasn't a map. It was a key, a combination." Josie looked at the strange rock again. The veins of silver weren't random. They formed a pattern, and the numbers etched on the bottom. "Bo," she said, her voice sharp, "where's your family Bible?" He looked up, confused. "In the parlor. Why?" Josie didn't explain. She grabbed the rock and strode into the other room, Toby and Clyde at her heels. She found the Bible on a small table, coated in dust. She flipped it open to the inside cover, where generations of Thatchers had recorded births, deaths, and marriages. Her eyes scanned the page, and then she saw it. Eleanor Grace Thatcher. Born June 8th. Married August 12th. Died October 26th. June 8th. August 12th. October 26th. 6-8, 8-12, 10-26. It matched the numbers on the rock. They weren't coordinates. They were Bible verses. Her fingers trembled slightly as she turned the pages. Genesis 6:8. But Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. Psalm 8:12. No, there was no Psalm 8:12. She frowned. Maybe she had it wrong. She looked at the rock again. The carving was crude. Maybe it wasn't an 8. Maybe it was a 9. Psalm 9:12. He does not ignore the cry of the afflicted. And finally, Proverbs 10:26. As vinegar to the teeth and smoke to the eyes, so is a sluggard to those who send him. Grace, cry, smoke. It was a message from a dead woman, a warning. Strayod is the sluggard, Josie breathed, the one they sent. Smoke to the eyes, the fire. She knew this would happen. She was telling you how they would come for you. But what about the other 2 verses? Grace and cry. Where was the mine? The cry of the afflicted, Bo said, his voice raspy. He stood up, a new light in his eyes, a terrible burning clarity. There's a place back in the canyons. The natives called it the place of weeping walls. The spring water seeps out of the rock face. It looks like the mountain is crying. My grandfather used to take me there. And Grace? Josie pushed. Bo's eyes met hers. My daughter. My wife named her Millie Grace. A chilling realization washed over Josie. She turned to where Millie was standing in the doorway, clutching Sparrow. The doll. The doll Josie had just mended. She had felt something lumpy inside the stuffing when she was stitching the arm. She had assumed it was just bunched up cotton. She walked over to the little girl. Millie, sweetie, she said gently, can I see Sparrow for just one more second? Millie handed her the doll. Josie's fingers went straight to the newly mended seam. She carefully pulled the stitches, reached inside, and her fingers closed around something small, hard and metal. She pulled it out. It was an old ornate iron key, the key to the mine. Eleanor had hidden it in the one place no one would ever think to look, in her daughter's doll, protected by her daughter's love. At that exact moment, the front door burst open. 2 of Stroud's men stood there, guns drawn. They had seen Clyde ride to the ranch. They had been sent to make sure no one interfered with the claim being filed in town. Well, well, the first man sneered, his eyes landing on the silver rock in Bo's hand. Looks like we found what the boss has been looking for. His partner's gaze fixed on Josie. A slow, ugly smile spread across his face. I know you, he said, his voice dripping with menace. Josie Calhoun, or should I say, Josie O'Malley. Your husband was a Pinkerton, made a lot of trouble for the syndicate back in Colorado. Right before his accident, Josie froze. Her past had just caught up to her. Bo stared at her, his mind reeling from this new revelation. A Pinkerton's widow. This woman hadn't stumbled onto his ranch by accident. She wasn't just a cook. She was a hunter, too, and she had brought the war right to his doorstep. The two goons advanced into the room, guns leveled. One of them was a big, brutish man with a scar splitting his eyebrow. The other was wiry and weasel-faced, the one who recognized Josie. "Give us the rock and the key, Thatcher," the big one grunted, "and maybe we'll just burn the barn this time, instead of the house." Bo stood his ground, clutching the silver rock, his knuckles white. The fear was gone, replaced by a cold, hard rage. "You're the ones who were here," he said, his voice dangerously low. "The night my wife died." Weaselface laughed. "She was smarter than you, knew what this land was worth, should have just taken the boss's offer." That was all the confirmation Bo needed. He let out a roar of pure fury and lunged, not at the men, but at the heavy oak table. With a surge of adrenaline, he heaved it over, sending plates and cups crashing to the floor. It provided a split second of cover. Josie didn't waste it. As the men flinched, she grabbed the heavy iron skillet from the hearth. It wasn't a gun, but it was solid, heavy, and familiar in her hand. She shoved Toby and Millie behind her. "Get back!" Clyde Harlow, old but not useless, swung his walking cane like a club, catching the big man across the shins. The man roared in pain, his shot going wide and splintering the doorframe. Josie moved. She swung the skillet in a wide, vicious arc, connecting with the weasel-faced man's gun hand. There was a sickening crunch of bone, and the pistol clattered to the floor. He howled, clutching his shattered wrist. Bo charged from behind the overturned table, tackling the big man around the waist. They crashed to the floor, a tangle of limbs and curses. The man was stronger, but Bo was fueled by a decade of repressed grief and rage. He slammed the man's head against the pine floorboards again and again. Outside, the sound of more horses thundered into the yard. For a heart-stopping moment, Josie thought it was Stroud himself, arriving with reinforcements. The fight was over. They were outnumbered. But then she heard a familiar voice shout, "Drop your weapons. This is the law." Sheriff Penrose. He stood on the porch, his shotgun aimed squarely at the doorway. Behind him were half a dozen men from Larkspur, farmers and ranchers, armed with hunting rifles and a stubborn refusal to be pushed any further. Clyde's frantic ride to the ranch had been followed. When Stroud and the sheriff hadn't returned, the town had decided to come looking for them. The weasel-faced man, cradling his broken hand, saw the armed townsman and his courage vanished. He scrambled out the back door and fled into the fields. The big man on the floor stopped struggling, his eyes wide with fear as he stared down the barrel of Penrose's shotgun. The fight was over as quickly as it had begun. Sheriff Penrose stepped inside, his face grim. "Bo, are you all right? The kids?" "We're fine," Bo panted, getting to his feet. He looked at Josie, then at the men from town who had come for him. He had spent years shutting the world out, convinced he had to stand alone. He had been wrong. "Stroud's gone," Penrose said. "When he saw us gathering, he rode out of town like the devil was on his tail. But he'll be back." "Let him come," Bo said, and his voice held a new kind of strength, a strength he'd forgotten he had. He picked up the silver rock and the iron key. "My wife left me a map. It's time I went and found what she died protecting." Josie looked at Bo, at the determination that had finally burned through his grief. She looked at Toby and Millie, safe for now. She looked at the faces of the neighbors who had stood up when it mattered. This wasn't just Bo's fight anymore. It was theirs. "The place of weeping walls is deep in the canyons," Clyde said, his voice heavy with warning. "It's rough country, dangerous. Stroud will know that's where you're headed. He'll try to cut you off." "He won't be expecting all of us," one of the ranchers said, checking the action on his rifle. Josie knew what she had to do. Her husband had been hunting the syndicate when they killed him. He was looking for proof, something to bring their whole rotten empire down. Maybe, just maybe, the Thatcher mine was the key to it all. This wasn't just about justice for Eleanor anymore. It was about justice for her own husband, too. "Bo," she said, "you and Clyde take the kids into town. They'll be safe there with the others. Penrose and I will ride for the canyon. We'll move faster with just two." Bo started to argue, but he saw the logic in her eyes. Protecting his children had to come first. He nodded slowly. Find it, Josie. Find it and show them all what Eleanor died for. He turned to Sheriff Penrose. You trust her? Penrose looked at Josie, at the skillet still clutched in her hand, at the fierce, unyielding light in her eyes. Right now, the sheriff said, a slow grin spreading across his face. I'd trust her against the devil himself. As Bo gathered his children, Millie ran to Josie and hugged her legs tight. You'll come back? She whispered. Josie crouched down, meeting the little girl's gaze. She gently tucked the iron key into Millie's pocket. You keep this safe for me, she said. I'm not going anywhere without my family. The word hung in the air. Family. Josie and Sheriff Penrose rode hard, the sun at their backs. The trail to the Weeping Walls was treacherous, winding through narrow canyons and over sharp, rocky ridges. It was a place designed to keep secrets. They moved fast, knowing that Stroud and whatever men he had left would be closing in. He knew the general location, but only Bo's memory and Eleanor's clues pointed to the exact spot. It was a race against pure, venomous greed. So, O'Malley, Penrose said, his horse picking its way carefully over a patch of loose shale. A Pinkerton's widow. You weren't just looking for a cooking job, were you? My husband, Liam, was investigating the syndicate's finances, Josie explained, her eyes scanning the cliffs above them for any sign of movement. He believed they had a hidden source of funding, something big enough to let them buy up half the territory. He was getting close. Then he had an accident in a collapsed mine shaft. I never believed it. And you think this is it, Penrose stated, the secret funding. A silver strike this big? It would be more than enough. It would make them untouchable. They rode in silence for a while, the only sounds the clatter of hooves on rock and the whisper of the wind through the canyon. The walls around them grew higher, closer, and began to glisten with moisture. They were getting close, water weeping from the rock face, just as Bo had described. Finally, they rounded a sharp bend and saw it, a sheer cliff face, shimmering with dozens of tiny rivulets of spring water that caught the sunlight like threads of diamonds. The place of Weeping Walls, and at its base, almost perfectly hidden by a curtain of hanging moss and tangled vines, was a low, dark opening. An old wooden door, reinforced with iron straps, was set directly into the rock. Josie dismounted, her heart pounding. She pushed aside the vines. There it was, an old, rusted iron lock. It was shaped to fit the ornate key that was, at that moment, safely in Millie's pocket back in Larkspur. He'll need the key, Penrose breathed, a hint of triumph in his voice. Stroud can't get in without it. But as Josie examined the door, a cold feeling washed over her. The wood around the lock was splintered and scarred. There were fresh gouges in the iron straps. He's already been here, she said, her voice tight. He tried to force it. A gunshot echoed through the canyon, and a chip of rock exploded from the cliff face, just inches from Josie's head. Get down, Penrose yelled, diving for cover behind a cluster of boulders. Josie threw herself to the ground as another shot rang out. High above them, on the canyon rim, she saw them, Stroud and 3 of his men. They had been waiting. It was an ambush. Looks like you brought me a key after all, Mrs. O'Malley. Stroud's voice boomed, distorted by the echo. Or did you leave it with the brats? No matter. You're going to open this door for me, or you'll die right here, just like your husband did. The confession hung in the air, sharp and clear. He had killed Liam. Josie felt a white-hot rage surge through her, so powerful it blotted out her fear. This ended here, today. Stay here, she hissed to Penrose. Give me cover. Before he could protest, Josie scrambled away from the door, keeping low, using the scattered boulders as cover. The syndicate men opened fire, bullets pinging off the rocks around her. Penrose returned fire with his rifle, forcing them to keep their heads down. Josie wasn't running toward safety. She was running toward the cliff face itself. She had seen something on their ride in, a narrow, almost invisible game trail that snaked its way up the side of the canyon. It was a dangerous, near-vertical climb, but it would bring her up behind them. It was a crazy gamble. But Josie Calhoun was done playing it safe. The climb was brutal. Her fingers, raw and bleeding, clawed for purchase on the sharp rock. Her lungs burned. Below her, the sound of gunfire was a constant, terrifying rhythm. She didn't look down. She just kept moving, pulling herself up, hand over hand. Liam's face swam in her memory, the faces of Toby and Millie, the grim determination on Beau's face. She wasn't just climbing for revenge. She was climbing for them. Finally, gasping for breath, she hauled herself over the ledge of the canyon rim. She was behind them. Stroud and his men were so focused on Penrose below that they hadn't seen her. They were crouched behind a rocky outcrop, reloading. Josie drew the one weapon she had left, the old heavy knife her husband had given her. It wasn't a gun, but it was silent. She moved like a shadow. The first man never even heard her. She was on him in a flash, the knife silencing him before he could make a sound. The second man turned, his eyes widening in shock, but he was too slow. Josie was a whirlwind of desperate, focused fury. Stroud spun around at the sound of the scuffle, his pistol coming up. He saw Josie standing over the bodies of his men, her face streaked with dirt, her eyes blazing with a righteous fire. "You!" he snarled, a look of genuine disbelief on his face. "Me," Josie said, her voice a low growl. "You took my husband from me. You tried to take a family from those children. You won't take anything else." He fired, but his shot was hurried, panicked. It went wide. Josie lunged, not with the knife, but with her entire body, slamming her shoulder into his chest. They crashed to the rocky ground, tumbling toward the edge of the cliff. The pistol flew from Stroud's grasp. He was stronger than her, his hands closing around her throat, squeezing the life from her. Josie's vision started to speckle with black dots. With her last ounce of strength, she brought her knee up hard into his groin. He grunted in pain, his grip loosening for just a second. It was enough. She twisted, grabbing a fistful of his hair and slamming his head against the rock. Once, twice, he went limp. Breathing in ragged, desperate gasps, Josie got to her feet. She looked down at Stroud, unconscious but alive. Justice wasn't killing him. Justice was making him pay for what he'd done. She used his own belt to tie his hands. Down below, the shooting had stopped. "Josie!" Penrose's voice echoed up, full of worry. "It's over, Sheriff," she yelled back, her voice hoarse. "It's all over." When they got back to Larkspur, dragging a bound and defeated Stroud behind them, the town was waiting. Beau ran to Josie, his eyes filled with a question she didn't yet have the answer for. She just shook her head, a tired smile on her face. "The mine is safe." Millie ran into her arms, pressing the iron key back into her hand. "You came back," the little girl whispered. "I told you I would," Josie said, holding her tight. The next day they opened the mine. It was just as the legends described, a vast cavern, its walls glittering with thick, unbroken veins of silver. But it was more than that. In the back of the mine they found Eleanor's real secret. It was a small, hidden chamber, and inside were boxes, not of silver, but of paper. Ledgers, meticulously kept records of every bribe, every forged document, every illegal transaction the Silverthorne Syndicate had ever made. Eleanor hadn't just been protecting the mine's location. She had been using it as a hiding place for the evidence she'd gathered against them. She had been building a case piece by piece. Liam O'Malley had been looking for the syndicate's funding. Eleanor Thatcher had been tracking their crimes. The ledgers brought the entire syndicate down. Stroud, faced with irrefutable proof, confessed everything, including the murder of both Liam O'Malley and Eleanor Thatcher. His testimony implicated men all the way up the territorial government. It was a cleansing fire, and it had all started with one woman's courage and another's refusal to give up. Weeks later, the Thatcher Ranch was a different place. The fences were mended. The barn had a new roof. The house was filled with the sounds of laughter. Neighbors came and went, borrowing tools and sharing news. The quiet isolation was gone, replaced by the steady hum of community. One evening, Beau and Josie stood on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky. Toby was teaching Millie how to skip stones across the horse trough. Beau had hammered a new sign and hung it over the gate. It didn't just say Thatcher Ranch, it said Thatcher & Co. Ranch. "Company, huh?" Josie said, a small smile playing on her lips. Beau didn't look at her, but he reached over and took her hand. His was rough and calloused, but his touch was gentle. Figured it was time, he said, his voice quiet. This place, it wasn't a home until you got here. I was just a man in a house. You brought the home with you. Josie squeezed his hand. She had come here looking for justice, for a ghost of her past. She hadn't expected to find a future. She looked at the two children, who now called her Mama without a second thought. She looked at the man beside her, his shoulders finally unburdened from years of grief. She looked at the land, now safe, and the town that had remembered how to stand together. Some families are made of blood, but the strongest ones, the ones that last, are often built with grit and grace, forged in fire, and held together by the stubborn refusal to ever let go. The story of Josie Calhoun and the Thatcher Ranch is a powerful reminder that the greatest treasures aren't always buried in the ground. Sometimes they're found in the courage it takes to open a locked door, to stand up to the darkness, and to build a family from the broken pieces of the past. It shows that one person, armed with nothing but determination, can light a fire that saves an entire community. What do you think? Was Josie right to ride into a dangerous situation? Or should she have focused on protecting the children from the start? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story of grit and justice in the Old West, and you believe that the toughest fights are always worth fighting, then make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the bell for more tales from the wild frontier. You won't want to miss the next story we have waiting for you, just over the next rise. Thanks for listening.